This is a timeline of COVID cases in America. It's the first 8 months of the pandemic following the virus's arrival in the US. These countries had far fewer cases of the virus relative to their population. Some implemented strict safety measures, others didn't. In terms of COVID policies, the US lands somewhere in the middle. However, in terms of cases, in terms of deaths relative to population, America is among the worst. One reason many experts say Americans failed to adapt to the pandemic is individualism, the long-held American principle of self-reliance.
It's interesting to think about it in terms of the pandemic. And there you get a kind of story, I think, that intersects with a particular kind of selfishness and self-interest instead of a kind of sense of the communal good. And it's a convenient kind of political rhetoric that people turn to at certain moments.
That commitment to individualism has been credited with fueling some of America's greatest historical accomplishments, creating rapid economic growth, driving innovation, and spawning entrepreneurs.
However, that same commitment to individualism could be why many Americans have refused to wear masks, refused to social distance, and now are refusing vaccines. But why are Americans so individualistic? How did the US become a country where self-reliance is more important than the communal good?
Protesters causing a scene and putting other people at risk in Century City. They stormed through shopping malls and supermarkets to spread their message, but public health officers worry they could also spread the virus.
In part, it starts with the founding of the nation.
Some of it you might tie back to the fact that, hey, we were founded under circumstances where we were kind of throwing off state oppression. So all of these, famous stories about the American Revolution are people who are saying, hey, we don't want the state overtaxing us or whatever. And so there's some of that history that surely is influencing.
America's commitment to self-reliance continued through westward expansion. The 19th century mass migration west referred to at the time as America's manifest destiny. 1 in 10 travelers died on the trail, so the journey took self-determination, grit, and an individualistic mindset. All traits that have permeated the American psyche, passing down through generations ever since.
And it becomes celebrated really quickly through the 20th century as a kind of heroic figure who kind of comes to a culmination in the 1950s in the cowboy movie of the sort of central standalone Western figure embodying a certain kind of moral compass and internal values. Rather than a kind of collective sense of a community building itself.
This is American Individualism. It's a book written by Herbert Hoover in 1922, who went on to become president 7 years later.
In it, Hoover sings the praises of individualism and American exceptionalism. Here he writes, "Our individualism is rooted in our very nature. It is based on conviction born of experience. Equal opportunity, the demand for a fair chance, became the formula of American individualism because it is the method of American achievement."
Hoover glorified the notion that self-reliance was what made America successful, what made America strong, what made America, America. One thing that's always defined America, that's seen as quintessentially American, is the suburb. Levittown, New York is often credited as being the first American suburb. Built in 1947, Levittown was a planned community for veterans returning from the war.
Today, a community of 60,000 persons living in 15,000 homes, all built by one firm. This is Levittown, one of the most remarkable housing developments ever conceived.
After the suburb popped up, many more followed, and Americans began to romanticize the idea of the suburban lifestyle. In the 50s and 60s, suburbs became increasingly popular, especially for families of European descent. This move out to the suburbs made car culture incredibly common. All of these new towns and cities across the US were built for cars, not people. Every aspect of the average suburban American's life requires a car, a drive, space between people. This is Dallas, and this is Frisco, a suburb of Dallas and Fort Worth. Starting in the 80s, going into the 2000s, this suburb expanded rapidly. But this is not an uncommon situation. This was and still is happening all over the US. In the 2018 census, around 52% of Americans described their neighborhood as suburban, while only 27% described their neighborhood as urban. That's a large contrast with other developed nations. Around 92% of people in Japan live in urban areas, in Australia around 86%, even in Finland around 47% of people live in urban or para-urban areas. These components of American life perpetuate a culture based on self-reliance, not communal cooperation.
It's private. It's their own little world. You have your little suburban thing that is, you've got your house and you've got space between the other neighbors. But it also means you don't learn very much about your neighbors. I shouldn't say neighbors, but your fellow townsmen or people, and the people who make this country what it is. It's made by all these different kinds of people.
One figure in American history who is often credited with embodying American individualism is Ronald Reagan. As an actor, Ronald Reagan perpetuated the 1950s era rugged cowboy image, which he later parlayed into a political career.
I'm going alone.
Why?
It's the way he is. You can't ask a man to change.
Their whole big government approach has institutionalized poverty, perpetuating its degradation until welfare becomes a way of life under the second and third generation of the recipient families. They have tried this raising of people by mass movements. Well, our philosophy is based on a belief in the individual, in his freedom and in his rights. And in this area of human relations, we're dealing with individuals.
Reagan romanticized America's commitment to the bootstrap mentality, making it central to his political ideology.
Partly has to do with the ways in which Reagan took the kind of rhetoric of his performances in Hollywood and turned that rhetoric into a set of political ends. Even when he was governor of California, he was already kind of rehearsing or portraying that same kind of character. The veneration of Reagan, I think, is one of the things that continues that sort of model of this is what American politics should look like.
Fast forward to 2020, when America, the land of the rugged individualist, is faced with a public health crisis that demands a communal response. Practice social distancing, stay home, wear a mask. Do these things not just for yourself, but for the health and safety of the community.
Like individualism is just the natural product, or it's one of the natural products of this project of liberalism. And so when I say liberalism, I don't mean like conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican. I mean this broader, modern, Western project that's been underway for several hundred years that we call like little L liberalism. So it's in essence like the unfolding project of kind of freeing individuals from unchosen constraints, if we can put it simply.
In spite of instigating a lockdown, closing gyms, movie theaters, barbershops, COVID-19 cases in the US still continued to rise. As states started to end their COVID lockdowns in May 2020, the US was still averaging around 25,000 cases a day, which at the time was a lot. Meanwhile, other countries were able to manage the virus and, in some instances, almost eradicate it. So what is it that connects these nations that handled it the best? In part, collectivism. Every country that has handled the pandemic with ease has a cultural mindset that's far different than that of the United States.
There is no widespread undetected community transmission in New Zealand. We have won that battle, but we must remain vigilant if we're to keep it that way. It is not and cannot be a return to pre-COVID-19 life. That day will come, but it is not here yet. To get there, our team of 5 million needs to have zero tolerance for cases to complete our goal of eliminating the virus at level 3.
That team, the 5 million New Zealanders that Prime Minister Ardern mentioned, acted collectively. The entire New Zealand population acted as a team. Collectivism is essentially a value that cherishes working together, something that is much more common in regions like Australasia, Scandinavia, and East Asia.
In this type of theory, like North American context or culture, pretty much emphasizes the independent, self-construal, and maybe East Asian culture tend to focus on interdependent, which is pretty much the same of collectivistic value.
Collectivism is the principle of prioritizing a group over self, the exact response some say is necessary to successfully combat a respiratory virus.
The collectivist response asks people not only to protect themselves, but to protect others around them, even those they don't know.
In short, in collectivistic culture, others do not exist, but in individualistic culture, others exist and it's kind of protected.
The question remains, post-pandemic, will Americans care about the other, or will the country continue its commitment to the narrative that the United States' success lies in its individualistic mentality?
So I think the stories we tell ourselves about the heroic individual and bootstrapping our way up through common success don't necessarily coincide with reality. Let's put it that way. There's stories that we tell about ourselves, and then there's our lived experience. And those two things don't always exactly line up.